thank you again for coming along this week. Today we're going to look at the imminent and very immediate events that have taken place in the last week in reference to international relations, and particularly the militarization of international relations. We're in a circumstance where there's been rapid action, unilateral action, on the part of individual countries and responses in the midst of very sheer debates, that is, huge debates and big schisms. And yet decisive military action has now got to be followed by something in what everyone recognizes has only a political solution in the long run. But we're in effect under the cloud of war as it occurs at this point. And a lot of things are very difficult under the cloud of war. Once exchanges which were diplomatic and political and on the level of statements take the form of military exchanges with weapons aimed at one another's installations, we're in a very different ballpark, and the pace and consequences of activity are enormous. So we're going to be looking at this whole question of, under the cloud of threatening war, resurgent militarism, and the climate collapse of fossil-fueled civilizations. We're in trouble here because our fossil-fueled civilizations are in the process of trying to assure access to and control over the remaining sources of fossil fuels, and yet they're in the situation of expending fossil fuels in order to assure control of the fossil fuels. That's a self-reinforcing and ultimately self-defeating process. If you start expending fossil fuels to acquire fossil fuels, you're going to be in the circumstance of an unending syndrome of collapse. It's a positive feedback loop, the more of which provokes the more of which. In other words, the more you do it, the more you have to do it, the more you have to do it, the more you get behind the whole syndrome of collapse. Well, we heard the breaking news of the US attack on Syria in response to what appeared to be the Syrian regime's attack with chemical weapons on populations in northern Syria. That hadn't been confirmed, but that didn't need to be confirmed for the assessment of President Trump to go ahead and attack the bases from which he was told by his military advisors these attacks emerged from the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. So that was the military exchange that took place. It's taking place under a wider context of US military buildup both in the Pacific and in the Middle East. The US has been in the midst of contesting China's creation of islands in the South China Sea, and it's beefing up its military presence in the Philippines. In fact, the exchange took place on the evening in which, that is, the attack on Syria took place on the evening in which the president was having diplomatic exchanges, conversations, with the president of China at Mar-a-Lago in the Florida White House. Tillerson has also indicated that the U.S. is willing to take military action against North Korea, if necessary, in order to deter it from pursuing its nuclear ambitions. And some have suggested that that, in fact, was the reason for the timing of Trump's attack on Syria, because in the evening in which he's talking to the Chinese about diplomatic, military, and trade issues, he's launching missiles that show, among others, to the president of China that the U.S. is willing to intervene militarily from now on in. And Tillerson has been underscoring this, but nothing could underscore it more dramatically than to announce this just as he sits down to dinner with the president of China. North Korea had also launched missiles in order to test them right during what it knew to be sensitive diplomatic missions in the United States, just as the United States was meeting with Japan earlier and then with China itself. Trump himself is known to be quite an enthusiast of nuclear weapons. He has supported their development and expansion in his new military budget of over $54 billion. It's really quite concerning to the world community in general that he is talking about building up further and further nuclear munitions. Not only is he talking, but we're getting people emerging to talk about the new nuclear posture, but not from within the administration itself, rather they're from the Heritage Foundation. Mikala Dodge, for example, has started to make statements about we, as if she's a member of the Trump administration. She's not, but this is a very worrisome kind of statement.
Barack Obama knew that a successor would try to reverse many of his policies. One of them could be Obama's commitment to seeing zero nuclear weapons in the world. The United States, under its first review of nuclear policy since 2010, might also end its moratorium on nuclear weapons testing.
We have not conducted an experiment in over 20 years.
Well, strictly speaking, as a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, to say we have not conducted an experiment in over 20 years is quite true, because the Heritage Foundation never conducted a nuclear test. But why is she using the word we as if she's a member of the administration and as if she can talk about the administration's nuclear policy?
And so, since then, we've made some changes to...
Who's made some changes? The Heritage Foundation? The Trump administration? The Pentagon?
our nuclear warheads, and we don't fully understand how those changes might play out in operational scenarios.
According to National Security Council officials, also on the table in the Nuclear Posture Review, recalculating the number of U.S. nuclear weapons and possibly adding new ones.
Yes, well, you can see how countries around the world would be concerned about what kind of information are they getting. Are they getting it from the Heritage Foundation, from the Trump administration, from the Pentagon, from the National Security Council? Very, very confused sending of signals at the same time that we're, in effect, launching missiles on other fronts altogether. This has promoted, in effect, a lot of activity among the scientists. And in the Union of Concerned Scientists, they came out very quickly and said no president should have absolute authority to launch nuclear weapons. The logic that a single individual acting without the advice of Congress, or even for that matter, his own defense establishment, that is to say it's not in place yet. It's the Heritage Foundation which seems to be making the statements about we this, we that, we the other thing. What about the professionals within the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, the U.S. Armed Forces in general? Well, this is why the Union of Concerned Scientists has said basically no president should have absolute authority to launch weapons. This comes as we're learning more and more, in effect, about the green zone, as it's called in this book by a fellow named Barry Sanders. The green zone has been a book that's looked very carefully at the environmental costs of militarism in general. Not just nuclear things, but militarism in general. the environmental costs of militarism are considerable. In fact, they far outweigh what our civic action often engages in. Take a look.
In fact, the Pentagon issued a dire warning about how climate change would become a far worse threat than terrorism. They predicted nuclear wars and rioting, entire countries flooded by rising sea levels, food scarcity and suffering. And the worst predictions are beginning to come true. Global CO2 levels just passed 400 parts per million, the highest seen in 800,000 years. We also had the worst year ever for global emissions. The Obama administration, by keeping us in a state of perpetual war, has made the world's environmental peril far worse. By continuing to extend the vast polluting fist of the US military into the rest of the world, we've created a future rooted not only in hatred and revenge, but ecological disaster. In fact, according to Sanders, our modern military has already committed some of the greatest environmental atrocities in the history of human civilization, and they're not done yet. We'll be referring to data from Sanders' book frequently in this episode.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Many in the rest of the world are already feeling the direct environmental side effects of our militarized society in the form of radioactive soils, sick and dying children, and poisoned drinking water.
It's 4 years. 1 year old. The prognosis is very bad. 80% died, mortality 80%. As we know, the DU may be transmitted by the wind and everything is contaminated now. The air, the soil, the food is contaminated by this material.
Thank you.
Well, this has been highlighting the fact that US militarism already has had an enormous impact, especially in Iraq and the Middle East in general, where we've been using depleted uranium as a form of munitions. This leaves radioactive material on the ground, in the soils, in the water, that have affected thousands, in fact tens of thousands of people from central conflict zones and civilian areas around them. In Baghdad itself, there is a lot of depleted uranium, as we're beginning to learn, from the debris left behind in the wake of military shelling. Well, people have warned us about this at great length. In fact, generals, General Eisenhower, who here with the British military leader, Field Marshal Montgomery, and the Soviet military leader, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and the French military leader, Delattre de Tassigny, at the end of World War II, announced the defeat of Germany, and it was Eisenhower who was the head of the military command of all of the Western powers at the time. In fact, he became the first military general in modern times to occupy the White House, because after the Truman administration, he was elected as a president of the United States. He began to realize that we were in trouble because we were getting into a competitive arms race that he saw would be dangerous to our future. Under the cloud of threatening war, he warned of humanity hanging from a cross of iron. A staggeringly insightful speech from 1953 as the Cold War was just getting underway. Take a look.
This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
This is not any way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. He was warning against the arms race. And he did so right up through his last days in office. In addition, he warned that if ever the presidency goes to someone who has not been in the military and knows as much about it as those who have been, then, he said, God help this country when somebody sits at this desk, meaning the president's desk, who doesn't know as much about the military as I do. Because the military became, in effect, in the Cold War, a force of its own, pushing for its own interests, way above that of the interests of the public. This is why the public often responds with articles like this: the U.S. should eliminate its nuclear arsenal, not modernize it. These are modern-day articles that are pointing to the fact that our build-up in nuclear ambitions, and particularly President Trump's effort to spend more and more billions on, quote, modernizing the nuclear arsenal, is itself self-destructive. People have been interviewed on this at length.
Let me ask you just to start with, the whole idea of the nuclear triad, should it still be the bedrock of America's nuclear deterrence policy, or is it an outdated idea?
There's very little rationale for maintaining a nuclear triad other than we already have one. And so now we're in the process of recapitulating this Cold War arsenal. All the services have a stake in keeping their weapons. Certain states have stakes in keeping their bases. So it's really a beautiful machine that we built during the Cold War to make the best nuclear weapons possible, and it's still running, and nobody's stopping it.
Nobody's stopping it. This beautiful machine is very profitable to the investor class, and we've seen the stock market continue to rise in the face of this new militarism. But a beautiful machine that is built during the Cold War to make the best nuclear weapons possible, and it's still running, and nobody is stopping it. Especially not the president. In fact, he seems to be stoking the idea.
An individual that many people consider as unstable, who has a volatile temperament, who is surrounding himself with advisors that many people have never heard of. We've never had a situation where that individual has been in control of America's nuclear arsenal. If President Trump decides he wants to launch 1 or 1,000 nuclear weapons, there is nothing that anybody can do to stop him. 4 minutes after President Trump gave an order, missiles would start flying.
Nuclear is just the power, the devastation is very important to me.
A foreign policy expert on the international level went to advise Donald Trump, and 3 times he asked about the use of nuclear weapons. He asked at one point, if we have them, why can't we use them?
There is a distinctive risk that we could have a nuclear catastrophe in the early stages of the Trump administration. We are worried that, particularly with this provocative new stance Trump has on China, that you might see him pushing hard in Asia. He might decide to push hard on North Korea. That would be a mistake.
That would be a mistake in the eyes of many experts who are particularly concerned that this symbolism of attacking Syria is not meant just for Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, or for those in the Middle East, but that it was meant for the president of China, whom he was hosting in the White House in Mar-a-Lago that evening that he launched the strikes. As Eisenhower put it, under the cloud of a threatening war, it is humanity hanging from the cross of iron. In his farewell address, he gave a warning about this that you should go back and look at. It was looking specifically at what the impact of an industrial system that has an interest in perpetuating armaments will have upon a civil society that is unaware of how it's being manipulated in military budgets and taxation and the like. And, as we said, he's reported to have said,
on at least one occasion, Eisenhower was heard to say by those in the room, "God help this country when somebody sits at this desk who doesn't know as much about the military as I do."
right. Well, I'm afraid we have someone sitting at that desk who knows nowhere near anything about the military as General Eisenhower did. And that's our problem. We urgently need a new kind of alliance between citizens and scientists in order to make the transition to a sustainable future.